Check. All right, we don't have to start now. We can banter for a few minutes. We were talking about the right Hegelian reading, Matt.
I remember like the last 2 weeks. I think it was like 2 weeks ago since Marion was there. We brought up like the Foucaultian reading of Hegel as kind of fairly standard, right? Always the totalizing philosopher, rates the state, that kind of stuff, right?
The servant of bureaucrats.
Yeah, it's too bad your like later interpreters can reflect badly on you. I looked into that the right left Hegelian thing though, and it looks like it used to be young Hegelian and old Hegelian. That was actually like an opposition. I don't know. I was reading around, and the young Hegelians are the ones who kind of do the more secular interpretation, and then the old Hegelians are the ones who did the what we would say the right wing Hegelian interpretation.
And Hegel's body wasn't even cold when that division popped up.
Yeah,
that's true.
There's this real emphasis on creativity and novelty, even more than fidelity to standard texts in like French academia and the social sciences, right? By the time Foucault and Derrida were writing, Hegel was considered pretty ubiquitous, right? Because of Hippolyte and Koyev and even Sartre to a certain extent, right? So
he's one of the big H's.
Yeah, exactly.
Heidegger,
like Heidegger,
Hegel,
right?
Hume.
So like the kind of implication he gave was that
it's Husserl, isn't it? Husserl's the third H.
Yes. Oh yeah, not Hume.
And so like a lot of these 68ers was the kind of term he used for them, right? Made their name by pushing against Hegel and characterizing him as responsible for everything that was bad, precisely because they needed to be original, which meant, pushing against, the bigwigs who were all Hegelians at that point. You know what I mean?
And then Deleuze broke the mold by writing on Hume and loving Spinoza.
There you go. Bergson.
Yeah.
All right. Well, why don't we kick this off?
Sounds good. Yes, let's kick it off.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to the Pill Pod, the podcast where everything comes from nothing and the points don't matter. I am your host, Plastic Pills, and with us we have players, Matt, Eric, and Guest. I'm going to wait to introduce Guest just to extend the suspense a little bit. He's come for our reckoning, and all of us are quivering as a result. So our last public episode, I proposed a vision of Hegelianism as something like Walmart. It's big, it moves into all the small neighborhoods, puts all the little shops out of business. And even though nobody really likes it, we have to keep going back there all the time.
Wow, way to throw down the gauntlet.
Because there aren't any other options, unless you're Deleuze.
I wasn't even ready for that.
Hegelianism is philosophy Walmart. But we also have to be dialectical about it because we always have to go back there. So, which means today we have brought a guest whose very name invokes terror into the Hegel haters, all the way from London, the real London, not London, Ontario. It is BORNA.
Hello, hi, pleasure to be here.
Now, BORNA is a scary type of person, you got to understand, because he reads details and then remembers them. And he also reads charitably, to discover truths and not just to get a hot take. So he's a very dangerous individual in this day and age.
Hopefully not that dangerous.
Not the usual pill pod fare.
So today we're continuing our talk of the state. And of course, the one thing that more or less unifies what we've been referring to as critical theory is that the state is bad. And current events don't really too much to dissuade that. More or less looks like a dumpster fire currently, as soon as it's faced with a crisis. And maybe today or soon in the future, I'm hoping we can move a little bit into Marx's state. I know that's another area of Borna's expertise, because Marx wasn't particularly fanatical about the state, and he thought it would become irrelevant long before now, presumably. But for today, we, of course, have states with us. Hegel talked about it often. And we kind of see states as managerial bureaucracies and so on. Sometimes they discipline and punish, if you were listening to our last episode. And many of the critiques of the state lead into critiques of Hegel. And today, we have BORNA here, who is a Hegelian, but not the kind of Hegelian it seems that Foucault and Deleuze, etc., are trying to refute or trying to challenge. wonder if anyone knows the historical background to this, because Hegel talks very favorably of Napoleon. So maybe we can begin by historicizing a little bit.
Ooh. If anybody knows.
Yeah, I mean, the apocryphal story, and I imagine Borna can tell us whether or not this is true, is that the Battle of Jena-Friedland, which basically gave Napoleon control over Germany and brought the French Revolution to the kind of backwards German-speaking world, in a sense, took place right as he was kind of finishing the phenomenology of spirit. And the kind of tale Hegel says is that he saw him, the emperor, world spirit himself in an individual, march into the city, crashing down the old world and bringing with him the new. And that seemed to be the kind of backdrop for Hegel's earlier revolutionary period. The kind of standard tale that I've heard is that he didn't necessarily become more critical of Napoleon in the future, but obviously by 1815, Napoleon was over and done with. And the kind of argument made was that Napoleon and thus the French Revolution had kind of fulfilled its historical mission, at least thus far. And therefore, world history now decided to discard them and send Napoleon packing to St. Helena, and the French Revolution kind of got recontained by the pushback by the various reactionary states, at least for a little while.
Yeah, that's broadly right. Hegel does make a reference to Napoleon in one of his letters to his friend in around 1807, I believe. He says that he saw Napoleon ride into Jena, which is where he was teaching at the time. And he calls Napoleon world spirit. So he says something like, I saw world spirit on a horse riding into Jena. Now, whether or not he actually saw Napoleon, the man, ride the horse in Jena, in terms of it actually happening, is hard to say. But it is true that there was a battle happening at the time, that Napoleon's troops were in the city. So he was probably maybe speaking a little bit, he was exaggerating, let me just put it that way. But it's a significant historical point because it speaks to how Hegel thought about political development and the role of political freedom in the world, especially how it relates to history. And I think if we're going to talk about Hegel and the state and what Hegel thought about the political state, one way we can approach the topic is to think about the role history and historical change has in how states are configured throughout different periods of human history.
I should also say that Hegel was a master storyteller. I mean, in some ways he tells the kind of biggest story that ever has been told in the history of Western philosophy, at the very least. And I imagine he knew that saying, Napoleon kind of was near the city that I was at just doesn't have the same kind of resonance as saying, I saw the emperor there wander in on his horse, bringing, the new world with him, right? It's got a bit more of a kind of poetic flourish to it. Speaking about it as if he's actually present, right?
His metaphors are as big as his thoughts.
There you go. Yeah.
I'd like to interject even before we get going, because here's the big risk, is that we are going to alienate people who have not read Hegel, or Borna is going to alienate us. But the thing about Hegel is all of these terms that get thrown around, it's almost impossible to turn them into language that is comprehensible. But our project is sort of to create a safe space from philosophy jargon as much as possible, which will make this conversation in particular a little difficult. But jargon is endemic in academic chatter. And the effect of that, I think, is that it's also convinced a lot of smart people that they're not smart. So if you're going to use terms, please try to put it into as basic an English form, or furnish it with an example if you can, as far as possible, if we can, to try to unjargonize this and show its relevance.
And that goes for any comment sections associated with this episode, you little
And I should say, just in case anybody who's listening has tried to read Hegel and felt that they were, it was an insult to their intelligence and was like, wow, I can't go through this. I must not be as smart as I thought I was. I remember when I read Bertrand Russell's pretty bad, I should say, History of Western Philosophy, he was complaining about how Hegel was impossible to understand. And Bertrand Russell might not have been a great interpreter of philosophy, but, as the author of the Principia Mathematica, I don't think anyone would deny that he was a very smart man, right? So even, super intelligent people struggle with trying to make sense of what the hell Hegel is saying. And so if you've ever read his book and you kind of are wondering what's going on, don't feel bad. You're in good company.
Well, not to derail this effusion of intellectual humility, but I think a good thing that I would like to focus on is the point that BORNA brought up at first, is this idea that we are historical beings. And just as good historians of ideas, we have to sort of trace this idea back to Hegel? This idea that we're historical. It's like today we take this for granted, right? We're on this sort of decade treadmill, right? Everything's 70s, everything's 80s, everything 90s. Today we're hyper aware that we are historically determined to some degree, that what is popular tomorrow isn't what's popular yesterday. But for Hegel's philosophy, this was something of like a revolutionary idea, right? Like the idea that thinking before him is static or ahistorical. I mean, maybe that's something we could sort of address, because that's going to be one of the most important things that comes out of it to Marx as well when we talk about him later.
Well, I remember when I was reading the lectures on, philosophy of history, and this was quite a few years ago. But I remember Hegel kind of acknowledges the fact that there have been historians going back at the very least to Herodotus and Thucydides, who had interesting things to say about the role history plays in framing our conception of ourselves, right? What he kind of implies in the lectures is that, but there hasn't been a philosophy of history in the firm sense until modernity, right? And he mentions a few different predecessors, people like Herder and so on. But he says, in my thought, history has finally become philosophical. But I do think if we're talking about Hegel's novelty, he does have a lot of claim to be an innovator in that respect, right? Making history into a central philosophical concern rather than a separate discipline that philosophers will occasionally dabble into, right?
Well, yes, this is true. It is true that there were predecessors, even in Germany at the time, or I should say Prussia at the time, before Hegel, who were doing philosophies of history. But however, Hegel can be said to take that project to its completion, because of course, not only does he have a philosophy of history, meaning he interprets human history in a certain respect, but he reads philosophy itself historically, right? So he famously gave lectures about the ancient Greeks and the medieval thinkers, and then the moderns, and then the German idealists. He would lecture from Parmenides, and the last lecture would be his own system. So I'm just pointing this up because it's important for us to remember, or kind of to acknowledge, that Hegel didn't simply have a philosophy of history, historical thinking and historicizing, if we can use this word, which just means treating concepts and ideas and people as products and as being products of and situated in historical contexts. So Hegel really takes that theme and basically applies it to his entire philosophy.
If you're in a history of philosophy class, this is almost commonplace now, because when we teach history of philosophy, I think all of us have probably taught a course similar to that, or Western thought or something like that. And you always historicize now. And is that something that would be different from the way philosophy was taught before Hegel?
I should just say, to add to that, there definitely is a dialectical quality to how those classes are taught, right? Like, well, this is how Kant contributed to Hegel's thought, and this is how Hegel's thought contributed to Marx's thought, and this is how Marx's thought contributed to Western Marxism, and so on, right? And there are definitely antecedents to that, but I think it's a very distinctively Hegelian way of teaching the history of philosophy, right?
Right. Pills, to your question about whether or not people teaching the history of philosophy, or even the philosophy of history prior to Hegel in a certain, maybe ahistorical manner, it's hard to say, I think. What I think is important to keep in mind is that Hegel really thematizes this for his entire system. And so when we're looking at what he says about, say, the formation of any political state, or why he's trying to justify the creation of the state, that question cannot be divorced from or isolated from what he says about the role of history in political life and in social life.
And I think also, I should say also individual life, right? Like, this is one of the odd things about the Phenomenology of Spirit, which is kind of his most famous book, alongside the posthumously published lectures, right? Because the Phenomenology isn't told as a kind of conventional philosophy book. It's almost like a coming of age story where spirit kind of progresses through these different phases in living time, if you want to call it that, and gradually ascends to absolute knowledge, right? So everything kind of has this kind of historical quality to it.
I'm going to de-jargonize you a second, Matt. So, yeah, the idea of spirit moving through time, he sort of tells the story of history as it's growing up. So you have a sort of juvenile philosophy with the Greeks, and then it moves through to the medievals and moves to the Renaissance to humanism, and then it's growing up in his time, which would be its movement through time.
And maybe we should mention too, though, there we're talking about the phenomenology of spirit or Geist, mind, but today we're probably going to be more discussing Hegel's ethics, philosophy of right, and what he says more about the state than less about his abstract philosophy.
Yes. So Hegel's most famous book, as I'm sure many of listeners have probably heard about or what have you, is the Phenomenology of Spirit, which he wrote which was published in 1807. And the Encyclopedia System, as it's called, which is made up of 3 parts, maybe about a decade later, around 1817 or so. And of course, his Philosophy of Right was published in the 1820s, and that he would lecture on these topics. But the Phenomenology is his most widely read work. But we're not going to be focusing too much on that, from what I understand. We're the question is, what does Hegel have to say about the state? Now, you mentioned Napoleon earlier, and I want to maybe get back to that. Because, of course, your listeners might be asking, well, wait a minute, why would Hegel support someone like Napoleon? Because isn't Napoleon a reactionary? Wasn't he a tyrant or a dictator? What's the impetus for Hegel to support someone like a Napoleon? And again, this question, I think, relates back to what we were just talking about the historical aspect of all of this. So Hegel did support the French Revolution. He had some criticisms of it, but till the end of his death, he would toast on the 14th of July. He would kind of toast the storming of the Bastille. He thought the French Revolution ushered in a modern era, and he thought all of humanity could learn from the French Revolution. He had a lot of praise for it. He was critical of the Jacobins because he thought they weren't able to properly usher in long-lasting social and political institutions. Now, when the French Revolution failed, and when Napoleon eventually was crowned emperor and started fighting the other European nations, Hegel thought this was a good thing because he could see that some of Napoleon's policies were progressive relative to the other European nation states at the time. So in Hegel's mind, he thought, yes, let Napoleon come and take over Prussia. Because at the time, Germany wasn't necessarily a cohesive state. You had a mix of different smaller states that made up Prussia. And Hegel thought that if Napoleon were to conquer Prussia, he would be able to modernize Prussia a little bit. Prussia would be able to be modernized through Napoleon's policies, as it were. So he had a progressive view of Napoleon, and he was kind of disgruntled when Napoleon lost and was defeated. So he wasn't too happy about that. That's one reason, or that's one of the main reasons he supported Napoleon, and it has to do with the history of France and the history of Europe at the time. So he always had his eye on the historical aspect of things. So the history is important, I would say.
Yeah, I wish I brought some info about this up, but yeah, go look at the Napoleonic Code, listeners. We're always taught in history class that it's actually quite a progressive code. It's happening in the context, too, of debates about should we return to a monarchy, right? So there are people who want to basically make the state dictated by the whims of a monarch and have that justification based on divine right. They were chosen by God. And for someone who's open-minded, not so much that his brain will fall out, like Hegel, I mean, he would obviously be opposed to this maybe sort of reactionary monarchical discourse that was going on at the time as well, I'm sure.
I also think it's important to look at the breakdown of aristocratic power that Napoleon represented, right? I mean, there are a lot of bad things that we can say about meritocracy, and as somebody who likes John Rawls, who we'll talk about later on, I think meritocracy is a bad thing. But it used to be that a lot of positions of power in European society were reserved for members of the nobility and, members of the clergy. You think about the two estates in France, right? And Napoleon, for a lot of people, especially young people like Hegel at the time, the fact that you could be this little Corsican who came from a backwater family, and you could rise all the way to the top and carry a lot of people with you would have been seen as extremely liberating, particularly when you go and you break down a lot of these old rigid aristocracies in different countries, and you allow a lot of other talented people shot at the top, right?
Would that be like the civil service, entering into civil or state service?
Yeah, that's what I would like to pick up on, because what did Napoleon do that was good in the eyes of Hegel was not that he went around conquering states. It's more that when he took over a place, he universalized codes, customs, rules, taxation law. I think driving on the left side of the road, having a last name. These are all universal. Wait. No, right side of the road. Right side of the road. These are all universal codes where he made everybody a subject to the state as an individual, but then there's this word universalizing, which is sort of having a law that covers all people equally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, Hegel is sometimes criticized, including by a lot of Marxists, right, for revering, the bureaucracy or kind of idealizing it. Yeah, but when we look at it in historical context, which I think we always have to do when we're trying to think about Hegel, right? The fact that you could have a bureaucracy that's open to talent, where educated people can kind of rise within it to positions of extraordinary power, at least for the 19th century, this was all pretty radical stuff, right? It used to be that, if you were in charge, it was because you were born into the right family, not because you happened to come from a middle-class family, got a good education, and then impressed the right people, right? And there are, of course, limitations to this viewpoint that we're aware of today, but it's important to recognize that it would have been a pretty progressive thing, I think, at least in some respects, for the early 19th century.
Well, even just putting yourself in that mindset of if you're in like Mainz or something, and then you go to Trier, then there's a whole different set of rules that you have to learn just from crossing like a single border of all these different duchy states. You don't know who's in charge. You don't know what kind of temperament that lord has. Then this one guy comes in and makes everything the same all across the board. I mean, that would seem pretty clean. It would seem like this is organized. This is better. So even though we could criticize the state, it seems that it would be kind of refreshing to have this borderless giant nation state that's unified by language, code, law, and not just by the temperament of whoever was born into power there.
Sound like a good liberal elite there.
Hey, I'm being charitable. I'm learning from BORNA.
Well, I think, this would actually be a good point when we could talk about the state in a more modern context, because a lot of the reason why the critics of Hegel that you brought up at the beginning were as voiceless as they were is because they saw him as eventually offering apologias for the emergence of something like bureaucracy, right? The EU, which created these big uniform blocks, established the same rules everywhere, broke down national particularity, and established, this bureaucracy rife with regulations and so on and so forth. And these are all things that you can maybe criticize Hegel for retrospectively, but I think we need to appreciate that at the time. It would have seemed refreshing, like you say, to have some unanimity on these things, and, reforms of regulation that weren't tied to the whims of an aristocrat or the king or something, right?
Again, it's the importance of Hegel's historical understanding, right? That it changes, right? Today we take these big sort of Eurocentric blocks as a bad thing, but maybe necessarily back then they weren't. They were a new idea, really.
BORNA, trying to move from this conception of the state as an actual historical thing that Hegel is watching develop, and then his notion of the state and the criticism against his notion of the state. How do you see that movement from totality He thought it was a liberating event to the creation of the state in a lot of ways. How do you see that working out au contraire to the people we brought up at the beginning and maybe brought up in our previous episode?
Right. Well, the first thing is to say is we have to maybe think about what Hegel actually said about the state. Why is it that he thought the state was, in some sense, necessary, right? So in the Philosophy of Right, which is his work of political philosophy, the project in this book for him is to lay out, as he says, a rational conception of social life. And so by rational conception, he means this is how a kind of social order will look like, and if it's based on reason, if it's based on rational thought. Now, he has reasons, and he explains what he means by rational thought and rational thinking. It has to do with his metaphysics, it has to do with what he calls the concept, and so on. But for our purposes, I think we don't have to really go into the details of that. We can just kind of deal with what he says about the social order in his Philosophy of Right. So the first thing that I think we should maybe get clear on is that Hegel argues that a social order has to be able to express the freedom of every human being, right? So Hegel starts off the book by arguing for the fact that human beings have free will. We have the capacity to exert ourselves, to, as he says, self-determine our actions. And for Hegel, what it means to be free is to be self-determining. We have to be autonomous individuals. And so no other person or thing, meaning no other kind of social institution or way of organizing our social order, can infringe on any individual human being's freedom. So right off the bat, that's paramount for Hegel. If we're going to have a sense of an economy, or if you're going to have social institutions, property rights, familial rights, marriage rights, law, crime, and so on and so forth, all of these have to respect and not violate human freedom. Now, that's what he does in the first two big chunks of this book, is he argues for what he calls the freedom of the will, and he relates that to his concept of right, which is Recht in German, which just essentially means the law, or kind of the rightful law, the dutiful rightful law of things. So for Hegel, this is paramount. Now, what he says about the state is, he says, look, if we're going to have a society, if we're going to have a social order that is going to respect individual human beings and their freedoms, you can't just have a social order where there is no state, where human beings are running around, violating each other's rights, like stealing things from each other or killing each other or so on and so forth. You need to enforce and coerce and respect people's autonomy in some way. And so he argues for social institutions. He argues for certain, he calls them estates, certain forms of institutions that kind of are built on this idea of free will. And in the end, in the section on ethical life, this is the section he calls the last part of his book, which deals with the kind of communal interrelations of individuals in the social order. There he says you have to have a state. And his reasoning is that if individuals, if human beings have to be able to assert their freedom, they need to be reassured in a way that their freedom is recognized as valid by the political order. And the way to do this, he thinks, is to have a ruling body, a centralized ruling state that, in a sense, reflects back to the people their free will. And so he says the state is the universal will of all the individual free wills in a certain respect. Now that sounds a bit abstract, but think about it this way. All he really means by this is, we can use modern examples, because what he's arguing for is effectively something like civic rights, civil rights. So if you look at the history of civil rights movements in the modern era, that you can read that or interpret that along Hegelian lines, because what did Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement fight for in the 60s? Well, they fought for voting rights. They essentially fought for being recognized by the American state as equal citizens, right? And if you can't vote, you can't assert your freedom, politically speaking. You are not counted as a free individual. And so, and there has been, by the way, a lot of Hegelian interpretations of Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement that kind of argue that you can use Hegel's philosophy to kind of support these movements. So similar with queer rights, similar with trans rights, any kind of marginalized group, if they're seeking validation and recognition from the state, can do so along Hegelian lines in this respect. Or rather, Hegel's philosophy speaks to their struggle, because he thought that the state, again, the state's main function for Hegel is to recognize and reflect back onto its people the fact that they're free in some ways.
I just want to push back against...
Sorry. I was going to just add a quick rejoinder to that. That might, that might rule out anarchism. If you're a libertarian, your ears might have perked up with the guaranteeing the freedom of the individual. But then once you started talking about the state, you might have lost the libertarians there, because I guess for libertarians, the state should really just guarantee their freedom, and otherwise it's freedom from the state. But that's not exactly Hegel's opinion, is it?
No, I know we're going to have to, that was a great layout to begin our dialectic.
Yeah.
And I know everyone's going to want to push back on one part of that or another, but, on its face, that sounds pretty good, right? That sounds not out of line with a Lockean or even a Rawlsian organization of society that the state is supposed to recognize people. So, Eric, you gave your rejoinder. Matt, do you want to add yours?
Yeah, and I should say I agree with everything that BORNA says, right? So this isn't a rejoinder of BORNA's interpretation, since I share it, right? I think that the kind of left Hegelian state that he's talking about, which is about the recognition of everyone's equal rights and the establishment of a kind of freedom that allows everyone's will to be expressed politically as equals, is something an ideal we're striving for. What I just wanted to ask is, isn't it possible to give a much more conservative interpretation of what you're talking about? And I say that kind of fallaciously since I know it is, right? There are a lot of right Hegelians out there, people like Roger Scruton come to mind, who would say what Hegel is actually talking about isn't the freedom of everyone as equals. It's not their freedom through the law that's important. It's their subordination to the law that gives them freedom.
Oh, Jesus.
And the kind of argument Scruton would make is that, listen, we have too individualistic a society right now where there's too much equality, too much freedom granted to people. This corrodes the kind of institutional and civic binds that are necessary in order to hold the state together. And so what we need is a far greater insistence in Hegelian sense upon our responsibility to the other, even if that means subordinating our will at any given moment.
Come back down to earth,
okay.
Matt.
Well, no, I'll give an example, right? One of the things that he talks about is LGBTQ rights, right? And he says that there's a lot of talk now about all this kind of liberal permissiveness and how it is that LGBTQ people need to be treated as equals through the law, and that it's wrong to marginalize them on that basis. But coming from a kind of right Hegelian standpoint, he says, what we don't recognize is that just as important as freedom through the law as subordination to the law, which enables freedom. And if the community has decided that they don't want LGBTQ people to be allowed to do whatever it is that they want, then the free community and the moral majority, if you want to call it, should be free to do so, because that's necessary in order to maintain a certain level of social stability and a commitment to traditions that we think are important.
I think even as a non-Hegelian scholar, I could tell you that the idea of subordination to law would just not be defensible. It's a riff on Hegel, but it's not an interpretation of Hegel that would be defensible by, as what we in the humanities call, evidence from the text.
Well, I think that there's more to it than you might, than some people give it credit for. I tend to agree with the standard left Hegelian interpretation of Hegel, precisely because, as BORNA says, right, he saluted the French Revolution till his dying day. He speaks a lot about freedom, but there is also stuff in the philosophy of right, for instance, about maintaining a monarch, how it is that he doesn't think that cosmopolitan institutions are achievable precisely because people are attached to the notion of the nation state in a way that they aren't attached to the notion of universal humanity. He puts a fair amount of emphasis on the importance of religion as a stabilizing factor. So I do think that there are theoretical resources people on the political right can draw upon from Hegelese, if you want to call it that, to support their own viewpoints also. And this is just kind of what I wanted us to get into. Which of these interpretations is more correct, and why should we buy in to the left Hegelian interpretation of the state that BORNA, I think, is rightfully putting forward.
Okay, so to simplify, I'm going to kick this to BORNA directly, but we're talking about the conflict between the group and the group's freedom, and then individuals as individuals and their freedom. And then we also introduced two distinctions, a right Hegelian interpretation and a left Hegelian interpretation. BORNA is obviously a left Hegelian interpreter, but BORNA, would you say there's any credibility to the other side of that argument?
There is. The thing about the left-right distinction is that it started right after Hegel's death in 1831, because his interpreters couldn't decide on which Hegel was the right Hegel. So generally speaking, the quote-unquote right Hegelian view emphasizes the more conservative aspects of Hegel's philosophy, and they're there, right?
I suppose we should all ask, could the real Hegel please stand up or something, right?
Right. And then the left Hegelians obviously have a more emancipatory reading. But it's one thing to note that so in the 21st century now, people working on Hegel today don't really take this right-left reading that seriously, because the issue is that they can both find evidence in the text to support their claims. And the irony is that Hegel's philosophy is so contradictory that even his interpreters can't really agree, which is why you have these vastly different interpretations. That said, I would say that the right Hegelian view that Matt has outlined has two problems with it. First, this idea of stability, or the idea that individuals ought to obey the law because that will stabilize the kind of social whole, right? One thing to note is that Hegel never believed in political stability. He believed in the opposite. So Hegel says that, look, throughout history you have political instability, societies change, empires rise and fall, and so on. And so he says this isn't a coincidence. This is all happening by necessity. And he argues that if we look at history, what's really happening for Hegel is that there's a worldwide movement. There's what he calls world spirit, kind of realizing itself through the actions of human beings and through their institutions and through their societies. And so the form that this spirit takes, if you can put it this way, is contradiction. So Hegel was obsessed with pointing out contradictions in different societies. So the reason he was a bit critical of the French revolutionaries, for example, was that he thought, look, Robespierre and the Jacobins made a mistake. Their reign of terror, their guillotining of heads was their answer to a series of contradictions they couldn't resolve. But he saw an issue with the way that the reign of terror operated, and he thought that wasn't a coincidence. And so for Hegel, he thinks that we can never do away with contradictions or with social antagonism. There's always going to be instability. There's always going to be antagonisms that come up. And so this idea that, the law and the state can basically force its people to remain obedient, and that will kind of be socially cohesive, is anathema to Hegel, because you can never do away with contradiction. Which is why he thinks things will always change, right? Societies and social formations will always take new shapes because of social antagonisms. So that's the first thing.
Before you go to the second thing, I think all of our Marxists are pricking up their ears as soon as they hear contradictions.
Yeah. Yes.
But so this is the notion of the dialectic, which is one of the very few terms I'll drop here. But when you talk about something being dialectical or history being dialectical, it's that these contradictions emerge, but they are productive. They're not just, it's not just a forever war. It's a war in a specific direction, and that direction tends towards freedom.
Yeah, it's not like the kind of contradiction that like a scientist looks for in their theories and their empirical observations that indicate that their theories are incorrect if it doesn't match up. It's not that kind of contradiction, right? But I wanted to ask, I want to hear the second thing you were going to say. But I just want to ask about contradiction. Does Hegel outline a central contradiction? I think the sense we get of Marx is that the central contradiction is between class consciousness and the means or mode of production, whereas for Hegel, I'm not so clear if he ever like gives thematic form like that, you could say, to any kind of contradiction that's central to his worldview.
So we have a few things to deal with. First is the answer to the central contradiction, and then BORNA's second point about right Hegelians. But Victor is not here right now. He asked the same question last week, and I suggested that it was freedom and necessity and universal and particular. And I kind of want to know, first of all, whether that's right, because I have no fucking clue. But if BORNA has a central contradiction in Hegel besides those.
Well, I mean, it's a tough question because Hegel never really says, here is the central contradiction of my philosophy, right? What he does do is point to contradictions all the time. And so this is how his philosophy, this is how his system operates, is through contradictions. You know, the one thing I should note, and this is kind of funny, is that during Hegel's PhD thesis defense, he was, you can actually read an English translation of it. He was asked to kind of summarize his thesis in 4 different points, 4 different theses. And one of these theses, this was when he was very young. This was before he wrote the Phenomenology. So this was in 1803 or 04, I believe. One of these theses, Hegel says that contradictions is the way of the true, identity is the way of the false. Now, to imagine the setting, you're at a Prussian university. These old Aristotelian theologians are sitting at the desk at your thesis defense, and they read this statement. I mean, that is absurd because it contradicts 2 things. It contradicts the law of identity, and it also contradicts the law of non-contradiction. But Hegel really thought this. He thought, look, if philosophy's business is to get at the truth, capital T, then contradictions is the way to go. You know, rather than avoid them and create logical systems that avoid contradictions, let's go through contradictions. Let's reconcile contradictions. So no, he doesn't point to any one specific central contradiction, unfortunately. But things like freedom and necessity, that's a big one. That's the topic of my PhD thesis, by the way. The universal and the particular is another big one. The individual and the social, or the individual and the world, is another big one. Or the individual and God, man and God, as it were. And Hegel was aware of all of these dichotomies, all of these contradictory binaries, if you want to think about it this way. But he embraced them.
Dude, that was a tight answer. I'm putting that at the beginning of the episode.
Yeah, that was good.
Fair enough.
That was as coherent of explanation of Hegel as I've ever heard.
Well, I should like to think so.
Do you want to move on to the second point?
Yes, I'm trying to... Matt, before I do that, Matt, if you could just reiterate the right Hegelian reading that you did, because I think I lost my second point.
And I'm sorry, I didn't mean to get backtracked. I just think that this is kind of selfishly moving it in the direction of politics that I'm interested in, right? And I've spent a lot of time with right Hegelians, almost by necessity since I work a lot in these regions, right? But the usual argument they give is to kind of give a Burkean interpretation of Hegel, Burkean being drawing influence from Edmund Burke, an 18th century British philosopher, founder of modern conservatism, right? And Burke was also interested in history, right? And the kind of argument he makes is that, putting it really simply, the world as it exists now has institutions that have proven themselves over time. They can be changed in some circumstances, but we should be extremely cautious about changing them. Precisely because they've proven themselves, and what people are proposing to replace these institutions with haven't proven themselves.
So marriage, for example.
Yeah, marriage, or tradition, or, stable political institutions, you name it, right?
Yeah, I mean, so this idea of subordination to the laws is I mean, yes, you can find texts in Hegel or textual support for that claim, but it's a rather strange one to just focus on this, because it's not as if Hegel says, look, the individuals can only gain their freedom by subordination to the law, as the law is in itself, right? Remember, he tries to argue that the laws of the state have to, be created, have to kind of reflect the rational concept that starts off with the free will of the individual, right? So Hegel, on the one hand, thinks, look, we can't do away with, or rather, the state ought not to ignore or negate the individual's free will, because then that's not really a free society. But neither should the state just simply be a reflection of an undifferentiated mass of people, right? So he wasn't, I mean, I say this because Hegel was also critical from a leftist point of view. He was critical of the liberals of his day, right? For the most part, because he didn't like this idea of treating human beings as individual liberal atoms. You know what I mean? He thought that was corrosive and ridiculous. And so he thinks there needs to be a balance of sorts between, again, a state that recognizes individual free wills and on the other side, you know, the subjects to the state or the people that live in this society, well, they do have to obey the law, but if they're being oppressed by the law, like some queer people are being oppressed in today's world, then that's an infringement of their right as free beings, Hegel would argue, I think. So I think you can really kind of point to two main problems with this kind of stereotypical right Hegelian reading of Hegel. The first one I mentioned was, the thing about stability. And the second one is the thing about the kind of relation between the individual wills of the people and the kind of universal will of the state that is supposed to embody the will of the people in a certain respect.
Okay, if I could just follow that up with kind of more down-to-earth example to give, Pill's accept Pill's preference. This is some kind of some rhetoric I see on the political right, drawing on this kind of Hegelian language. It's actually quite popular. I see people in the IDW make this kind of claim all the time, right? Freedom means my freedom to enact the kind of laws that are consistent with our community values, right? In our community, a majority of the people believe fundamentally that same-sex marriage is wrong. And we should have the freedom to enact that in law to express the ethical spirit of the community, if you want to put it really simply, right? And you're saying that we should not be allowed to do that because that's a violation of the freedom of the individual, is imposing a limitation on our freedom to express our ethical viewpoints through law and have them enforced by the state. And not only is that, a violation of our freedom in this sense, but it also corrodes the same ethical mores that are necessary to hold our society together, and treats everyone like they are just individual atoms who should be allowed to do whatever it is that they want. That's pretty much like the stand, particularly when it comes to sexual issues. So how do you think Hegel, the proper reading of Hegel, let's call it that, since I think we've all agreed that's the one we want, how would the proper Hegel respond to that?
Well, he would.
What we want is the right one.
Carbon date that after that Slim Shady reference. Now you're the latter half of the Jurassic period, I think.
Well, there's a reason that we didn't invite any conservatives on, and probably will never, because I'm not interested in debate.
Yeah.
I would guess, and maybe I'm wrong, but Hegel might even say that as long as like at that historical moment, the laws really do reflect the will of all the individuals in that community, then it's not necessarily a contradiction there. The only thing would be to assume that human nature is static and ahistorical and won't change to revise that view and become out of step with the state of things and the state itself.
That's an allowance that I think is one of the reasons why I can never dismiss Hegel out of hand, despite what Deleuze and Sartre and everybody else thinks, is because he always has that ability for things to shift inside the system. And that's an allowance, regardless of whatever his personal views were. And some of them were not, politically correct. But even if his weren't, he would have an allowance for that idea to develop into a greater sense of freedom.
One thing I think we should just quickly clarify, what Hegel really meant by, the free will and people asserting the free will. So he didn't mean this idea that people can just do what they want. if you see what I mean. So to Matt's question, this idea that, people can protest a certain law because it violates their religious beliefs, and, this is my community and these are my beliefs and so on and so forth. Hegel hated that. He actually wrote against that very idea when he was alive. He thought it would be horrible. So one of Hegel's criticisms of democracy is sort of based on this idea. He says, look, democracy is problematic because it is totally dependent on the contingent whims and beliefs of the mob, more or less. This is similarly what Plato thought about democracy too, right? But Hegel says, look, if you have a political system that is always entirely democratic for any reason, meaning every single person gets the same vote, and he thought that was a problem because there's no necessity behind that structure, behind that political order. So if you base a law or a social order based on, as he would say, the kind of arbitrary will of the people, so I believe X, therefore Y should happen. Hegel hates this idea because there's no necessity behind it. Today I think this about trans people. Tomorrow I wake up, I change my mind because I become more enlightened and I endorse trans rights. And Hegel would say, well, okay, but we can't have a social order that is entirely dependent upon kind of happenstance arbitrariness of people's ideas in their heads, right? Or their beliefs, or their personal beliefs. So when Hegel says people are free and they have free will, his conception of free will does not mean that human beings should be able to do and say what they want. That's not what he's saying. In fact, he hates this idea of free will. He hates the idea of free choice because it's not really free. For Hegel, free will means something very specific. It means the ability to assert itself. It means that the free will is free only to the extent that it is self-determining, right? And by self-determining, like I was saying at the beginning of our show, means the ability for that individual to determine him or herself without any other external person or structure impinging on their ability to be self-determining. Right? Now, what does this mean? Well, this means that, for example, so Hegel thought, look, human beings have the right to have property, like a house and, things that you need to live. He thought that the way that you make your free will recognizable to others is to have things, including your body, by the way, right? Now, to give a really contemporary example, we can read the Black Lives Matter protests, the rebellion that's been happening since early June, in Hegelian lines, because Hegel would say, well, look, clearly this is a society that isn't respecting the autonomy of a big segment of its population that have been oppressed for years and years and years. And the laws in place in America, for example, but also in Canada, and also here in the UK, aren't as equitable, aren't as reflective of the freedoms of human beings that he think is innate in people. So he would have an issue with the fact that Black people in America are still fighting for their dignity and for their equality, right, for their economic and social rights. And so you could read Hegel and support that cause on Hegelian lines, if you see what I mean. I hope that answers really the question.
No, that really clarified things. Thanks.
Oh, sorry.
I'd like to ask, in that context, about working class versus like middle class. So if self-determination extends to this freedom to extend your will, is this just the state stays out of interfering with you, or the state is also responsible for you having something like social mobility? Or should the state be responsible for your health? Should the state be responsible for making sure that you have a home, making sure that you have access to other things that would enable you to live your life? Or is that too much interference?
That's a good question. Sorry, go ahead, Matt. You wanted to...
No, I was just going to give like a kind of contemporary reading of Hegel that I'm actually quite fond of. I evoke it a lot in my book that's coming out soon on liberalism and liberal rights. But Axel Honneth's reading of Hegel is that self-determination has three different forms. And a proper state is one that enables people to be as free as possible along all three different dimensions. Maybe that's a better way to put it. As it's capable of doing. And the three dimensions of freedom are negative freedom, He draws this from Isaiah Berlin, I should say, right? A negative freedom is pretty simple, right? It just means you are unconstrained from going about your day-to-day life to the extent possible, right? And you can associate that with all the standard liberal liberties, right? Freedom of expression, freedom of religion, freedom of mobility, freedom of life. Then he also talks about substantive freedom, which are all the kind of forms of freedom that come from having things like personal property, being relieved of concern about your health to the extent possible, having enough capital to actually lead a meaningful life rather than being faced with economic precarity, and so on and so forth. And the last dimension of freedom that Hannah talks about in this kind of Hegelian vein is social or civic freedom, which is the freedom to have a substantial say about the kind of social institutions and laws that govern you. And this is where he feels that even modern welfare states fall really far short of the mark, because he says, while a lot of these states are quite generous in terms of the substantive freedom that they enable for their citizens, and they're uniformly amongst the most free states, if you're just looking in terms of negative freedom, very few people actually feel like they have a meaningful capacity to influence what's going on at the institutional level. So their social freedom is seriously inhibited. That's the way that I usually like to interpret it in a more contemporaneous setting.
Well, that would seem to answer Plastic Pill's question. I don't know.
Yes, I mean I don't have a. Haneth's reading is interesting for that reason. It's broadly consistent with kind of Hegel's idea, but I mean you can even kind of stretch it further. So again, if we want to take the historical view, right, we have to remember that Hegel was writing and lecturing on political philosophy in the near the late 1820s, and his views changed because in the early lectures he actually wrote about what he calls the rabble rousing, kind of the very poor, angry, unforgotten lumpen proletariat, as Marx and Engels say. And in the earlier lectures, he's more sympathetic to the economic problems that a lot of people face. And he is very viciously critical of the state for not helping to quell poverty. Now, his views, not that they change, but that radical tone isn't really present in the philosophy of right. And one of the reasons for this, and there's letters and other documents that attest to this, is that Hegel was, at the time, very concerned with the Prussian state. The Prussian state was censoring, or there was a censorship law in place at the Prussian state at the time. And one of Hegel's heroes and one of his colleagues, Fichte, lost his job at the university because of being charged with atheism. And so Hegel was very aware that he said, look, if I'm going to publish a book on political philosophy, I can't have this critical radical tone. So there's a lot of interpreters of Hegel who kind of take that view that he had more radical views even until the end of his life, but he had to codify them in the language of the philosophy of right as to not seek the wrath of the Prussian state. That's one thing to say. And another thing to say is that Hegel didn't live long enough to see full-blown industrial capitalism come to the fore, right? So Hegel dies in 1831, and it's really kind of in the 1840s, 1850s, especially here in England, right, that industrial capital, and the productive power of capital really comes to the fore. And so Hegel isn't alive to see the kind of contradictions inherent in capitalism. He wasn't able to kind of appreciate that at the time, really. And I personally think you can kind of extend the Hegelian project by going to Marx and Engels for that. But it is true. He really had really critical things to say about the state's inability or lack of ability to help the poorest people in society. And so the question we should ask ourselves is, what happens when the state doesn't look after the freedom and the well-being of its citizens, right? What happens when their autonomy is violated, either economically or with this pandemic in terms of our health, right?
They tried to achieve a welfare state that was sufficiently robust and cared for everyone's needs in the 1950s, but they did so in a very top-down way without enabling social freedom in any meaningful sense, right? This was going to be a technocratic project where elites were going to say, here are your needs and we're going to take care of them for you. But because like the demos, right, the democratic population wasn't really a part of this process of generating the welfare state, it was only going to be a matter of time before capital kind of struck back, seized control of the state apparatus, and used it to institute this kind of neoliberal global order that worked in its interests and started to roll back the welfare state. And because, the demos wasn't actively involved in politics, there's very little that working class movements could do to prevent this from happening. If you want to take a second crack at establishing a truly free state that enables substantive freedom along with negative freedom, you have to make sure that people are involved, and that includes at a grassroots level all the way up to the top. Because if you don't, the state is eventually just going to be co-opted by power, by capital again. And it's just going to use its authority to claw back any benefits that working people were able to achieve for a temporary period of time.
Yeah, that sounds about right to me. I mean, it makes sense. You can kind of read that along kind of broadly Hegelian lines in this respect.
I don't know if we want to get back into a question I kind of have, but it seems like we've sort of arrived at a contradictory position for the state, or a contradictory role of the state. Because, okay, on the one hand, if we just say that we're supposed to subordinate ourselves to the law of the state, then we might as well just read Hobbes and forget about Hegel. But for Hegel, the state has to reflect the freedom of the individual and, in a sense, protect it or guarantee it. But what about laws? Like what is a law for Hegel? The state also has to regulate. It also has to restrict freedom or make laws. Like, how does he sort of articulate this sort of dual role the state has of reflecting freedom, but also being a sort of regulative or lawmaking legislative body?
But the law should come not from even a democratic position, but the law should come from this universal rationality. And I'm trying to figure out how that could ever work in practice, or how he expects it to work in practice. Does he just hope that there are philosophers in the government?
So whenever he says universal rationality, what he means is this idea that, because look, for Hegel, his whole social and political philosophy is based around this idea that the social order is rational, right? That it's necessarily rational. And what he means by that is that it abides by the logic of what he calls the absolute idea. Now, all that means I'm not going into the metaphysics of it, but for our purposes, the absolute idea is a self-determining idea. It is, in effect, an idea of freedom, but not just an idea of freedom that is one-sided as simply being self-determining. It's this idea that freedom can only be actualized or realized in the world if it embraces its external relation to otherness. For example, if I want to make sure that my freedom is respected and upheld in the law, I have to work with other people to make sure that their freedoms are respected as well. It's a universalizing process, right? So any law for Hegel, or any sort of laws that come about through his notion of the state, they have to be able to have a sort of rational necessity behind them. They have to be universally rationally necessary. And what that means for Hegel broadly is that, again, it has to reflect the self-determining aspects of human beings. So for example, this idea that only a segment of the populace can own property, or rather, only a segment of the populace should have voting rights because they can own property, which was the case in Europe for the longest time until the French Revolution, which then universalized voting rights a little bit. That would go against the self-determination of human beings in a certain respect. And so the law, while maybe partially democratic, isn't as democratic or isn't as universal as it maybe ought to be, right? And it's not truly universal in that respect.
If democracy is not to be trusted because it's impulsive, then is their right to revolt the only recourse that they have?
It seems to me that he constantly comes back to this point, right? That you can only become meaningfully free through recognizing the freedom of another and forming a genuine relation with them. And in the same way, the state can only be a meaningfully free place where everyone has the same kind of freedom equally guaranteed to all of them. Otherwise, even those who are the beneficiaries of some kind of inegalitarian system will eventually be forced to recognize that the contradiction that this represents is going to lead to social collapse. Does that sound right?
Yes, I think that's broadly right. But to Pills's question, hold on, can you reiterate your question? I had it and then I quickly forgot because you asked about.
Well, let's get way out of space and turn Hegel on his head and put his head on the ground. If a class of people's rights
the revolution
are violated, if they're violated in Minneapolis, do they have a right to revolt in something like John Locke said, if the sovereign's allowed to have power over you until it violates your power. So when Hegel's talking about the formation of these laws as an expression of universal reason, and at the same time saying democracy, no, it's too impulsive, then what is the rights of the oppressed in that case?
Well, yes, I mean, this gets a bit complicated because remember his criticism of democracy has to do with forming a political society, or rather forming a society based on the idea that you simply give in to the whims of the mob at any given time, right? And so he hates that idea because it's too contingent, it's too again, there's no necessity behind it. There's no reason for people to do X, Y, and Z because the mob will change its view all the time, right? But that's different from the question of human autonomy and human freedom, right?
Okay.
Because remember, for Hegel, freedom is paramount. I mean, Hegel virtually supported every revolution that he had read about throughout history, everything from the slave rebellions and revolts in the Roman Empire to the German Peasant War to Luther's Reformation, to, of course, the American Revolution, the English Revolution, the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution, and so on and so forth. And so when you see what he says about these things, for example, let's take the French Revolution, because it's the most famous example that Hegel wrote about a lot. He supports it on the one hand because he thinks that the social conditions in French society at the time have created the reasons for a revolution, right?
So it's almost more rational to revolt when the state becomes repressive than it would be for the state to continue repressing.
Yes, but I mean, those are very kind of extreme circumstances. So it's not as if, and
Right.
So, there's a reason why people aren't revolting all the time, rebelling all the time. But rebellions do happen, riots happen. And Hegel had a very contextual view of these things. He's not going around moralizing about them in an abstract way. He's trying to look at the historical context. France had contradictions that King Louis was not resolving. Let's just put it that way. And you can do the actual historical work on this. There's many great books that show that France was in huge debt, that there was vast, material inequality in France at the time. And, when Marie Antoinette says eat cake, well, that's not going to help anything. And similarly, if we just think about the riots, and the uprising against police rebellion in America in the last 2 months or so, we can see that the same kind of idea or, the same kind of Hegelian reasons are there, right? So if the police force is routinely murdering its unarmed citizens for no real reason, then those people have a right to revolt. By necessity, they kind of rise up and fight back. And Hegel would kind of point to the necessity of it. He would kind of lean heavily on that. But again, I want to stress, this is different from his criticisms of democracy as simply being based on personal beliefs and values, right? Freedom for him is not a personal belief. It's not a personal value. Again, freedom for Hegel doesn't mean I can do what I want or I should have freedom of choice. It means it's a very specific, cohesive thing. There's an ironclad, logical, rational necessity behind human freedom that will exert itself and explode in social settings if it's oppressed or violated for too long.
Okay, I have a bit of a harder example for you then. And Matt, you can jump in right after this. A harder example, I'm walking around, I want to go get a bite to eat. Then the people there refuse to let me eat because they say, you have to wear a mask. And I don't want to wear a mask because it's going to block God's natural breathing apparatus that he's given me to breathe with. Does the state have a right to tell me that I must wear a coverage to my God-given breathing apparatus on my face? And do I have a right to revolt in that context?
Well, I think Hegel would say that the state has a right to, demand that you wear a mask because it's for your well-being and it's for the well-being of others, right? And so this COVID mask thing only works if everyone wears a mask. There's a reason that Japan only had under 1,000 deaths and they had no lockdown, and it's because everyone wore masks, right? And so Hegel would say, well, if you think the state is infringing on your right because they're demanding you wear masks to protect your life and the lives of others, then you're being a bit of an idiot. You're not really thinking rationally about your freedom and about the freedom and well-being of others, really. And in that scenario, it wouldn't be an infringement of your personal right. Remember, freedom is not simply I can do what I want, right? It means you are a self-determining being, and that self-determination, that autonomy, is applied to the social order and it's applied to the laws in the state and the social institutions. So when the social institutions and the state, for the good of the people, say, look, wearing masks, which is just like wearing a seatbelt, which you should also do, right? If this can save lives, then please do it because we're trying to save lives at the moment. If Hegel were alive today, I'm sure he would look, he would scoff and be insulting to the people who don't wear masks. And he could be very, very mean sometimes. So
this is a little bit of a slippery slope, though, right? Because then what is the measure? And I think it's going to be some weird word like the absolute or something like that. But what is the measure of when it is in the interest of a group and when is it not in the interest of a group anymore? Where does the measure come in for that resolution of the contradiction between the individual and the social group?
It's a complicated issue because Hegel thought that on the one hand, the individual, the autonomy of the individual has to be respected, right? But I want to clarify, when Hegel says freedom means self-determination, again, this doesn't mean that you can do what you want or you can, you're free to choose to have Coke or Pepsi. You know what I mean? Self-determination doesn't mean I can do what I want and society should just allow me to be free and it should just let me do what I want.
You say that, BORNA, but if I wasn't free to choose Coke over Pepsi, I would feel pretty fucking constrained, okay? Because one of them is a decent beverage, and the other is basically just swill, okay? So let's just be clear on that.
That's true. I'm a Coke person myself, so
I am.
So I agree with you. But the point is that so Hegel criticizes this kind of freedom of choice idea of freedom, and he calls it arbitrary, right? He says, look, if you think freedom means, I should be able to act based on my emotions or based on what I see outside of me, Coke or Pepsi, I should have a choice. Then Hegel says, look, you're not free for two reasons. Because for Hegel, freedom means self-determination, and that means you use your free will to externalize or to express your self-determining capacity. And so the question is, well, wait a minute, what does self-determination mean? Or what's the content of self-determination? And Hegel says, well, look, there's no distinction between the content and the form of self-determination. It's just self-determination. That's what it means by freedom. So he criticizes this idea that, I'm free if I can act according to how I feel and think. Because you're not really free because that, there's no necessity behind that because it's entirely dependent upon how you're feeling. So, for example, if I want to go and buy a can of Pepsi, right, that wouldn't be a free act for Hegel because the content of that action, namely me going and buying a can of Pepsi, doesn't just arise out of my being as a self-determining being. It arises from my personal want for Pepsi. And if you interrogate that need, that thirst for Pepsi, you realize that I received propaganda from commercials to make me think that I want Pepsi. And it's not really my choice at all. It's the choice of the Pepsi company, for example. So if you're in that position and you're compelled to make a choice, that choice isn't free, because the content of your choice is something that is imposed on you from without. It's something that is imposed on you from someone else, if you see what I mean.
So what constitutes political action ever then? Because our only political action is to vote. And from what you're saying, that kind of vote is not a real, actual free decision in the first place. So what could be a political decision?
It could be, right? So, for example, if the political decision to vote is based on the idea of extending the freedoms of other human beings, then that is properly aligned, let's say, with the necessity of freedom for Hegel in this respect. But if we're voting to, if we're voting to suppress the freedoms of a certain group, then of course that's not necessarily aligned with this idea of freedom. Now, is it?
No, it's more about what constitutes a political action, because by what you're saying, liberal versus conservative, Democrat versus Republican, or Labor versus
conservative,
Tory, none of these are real choices.
I'd actually like to weigh in on that by saying that I think, again, the richness of this is in demonstrating that a lot of things can have political significance, even if they don't appear to be political on the surface of it. So imagine you have an abusive husband, and what he really wants is love and recognition from his wife. But he lives in a patriarchal society. He's in a situation where the laws give him all the power to dictate the terms of this relationship. He might think at some point, well, the best way to get love is to force my wife to demonstrate she cares for me by doing everything that I say, and she can have no choice in the matter, right? And then any time when she tries to rebel against my expectations, I'm going to use physical violence or the threat of law and coercion in order to get her back on track, right? And Beauvoir would say that in this kind of circumstance, because what this person really wants is love and recognition from another, by constraining her free choice, he's not going to be able to determine himself in the way that he wants. And of course, she's not going to be able to do so either, since she's imposed by these kinds of constraints. So a very political action in these circumstances might be for both of these individuals to say, our relationship is toxic, and it's predicated on all these bad social circumstances that tell us what men and women should do. So we need to break out of that and try to have a more emancipatory relationship where both partners are going to stay with one another because they truly care about one another, and this is what they want to do in order to achieve self-determination together. And from the kind of locus of what seems like a very personal choice, you can expand and derive far more obviously political consequences, right? That patriarchy is bad and we need to get rid of it because it's the only way men and women are ultimately going to be happy.
What about getting rid of it? How do you do that? I'm talking about apropos the state. What is a political action besides revolt?
Well, but I think this is what I was trying to get at, right? For someone like de Beauvoir following Hegel, right? The decision to create a more free relationship with this other person might not seem political on the surface of it, but it actually has political significance.
But you could say that about anything.
But I think that's kind of, again, where the richness of his analysis comes in, right? Where he says that...
I see that as a paucity of analysis, if that's the only recourse you have, is to be nicer to people.
Well, I don't think he's saying be nice to people. I think he's saying that, you're not going to get what you want in this relationship if you're trying to force someone to be with you. And it's when enough people gradually start to feel this way about certain forms of constraints that exist in their life, that you start to see a contradiction emerge between what it is that people want and how it is that institutions and the state try to impose constraints on people. And that's when you start to see revolutions occurring.
I think a little bit of the problem of the way we talk about Hegel in these situations is that Hegel, again, is this historical contextualist thinker, right? So when you look at something that's happening today, and then you go back to Hegel's philosophy and you ask, what constitutes political action? What constitutes this or that? What we're really asking for are these eternal rules that at any time and place we can determine what constitutes political action or what constitutes equality between the state and the individual. But what Hegel's main point is that no philosophy can transcend its own time. Philosophy's job, in a sense, is to comprehend its own time. And when we look for these universal rules that apply to all times and all places, we're sort of going against this historicizing ethos of Hegel's philosophy as well, right? Like even Friedrich Jameson says, always historicize. That's the point. So when we sort of do this back and forth motion of, well, this is happening now, I'm going to go look at this philosophy, and then I'm going to derive from it a rule that I can now apply to this time and place, it sort of runs against the grain of, it's a problematic way of talking about Hegel's philosophy. We're trying to cash it out in the pragmatist sense. And that's not, and that I don't know, that's not a great way to deal with Hegel's thinking.
But I think it's a great way, right? Because one of the things that he points out is, again, the owl Minerva only sets at dusk, right? And sometimes actions that seemed highly personal and apolitical, in hindsight, take on greater historical significance. Say opening a gay bar, right? If I were to open a gay bar now, probably wouldn't have all that much significance in Canada or even the United Kingdom, right? If I decided to open a gay bar in 1950, that might seem like a fairly trivial personal decision where people can come in and drink and smooch and do all that kind of stuff, but has more historical significance seen in hindsight, since it was an effort to kind of change people's conception of themselves, their relations with one another, and the kind of self-determining freedom that was appropriate, right? And with 70 years, looking back, we can say, well, when that club opened up and, gays were allowed to go in and live their lives and not be interfered with, this was kind of a landmark moment, even if the people who opened it up weren't intending it to be this kind of big significance thing. They just wanted to have drinks and hook up. You know what I mean? I think that Beauvoir says something similar, right? When women start to stand up for their rights and say, don't tread on me. If I want to be with you, it's because I should want to be with you, not because the law forces me to. That might seem extremely personal, but the first person who decides to break up with their husband and live an independent life, even if she's doing it just for herself, in hindsight, that takes on greater political significance.
But that's a good way to look at it, right? Like the reason Hegel's opposed, for instance, to the discourse of natural rights is because natural rights are pre-given. They pre-give any historical state of things or any moment at which humans think about themselves and determine their own human nature. And again, if freedom is the concept of self-determination, then the whole discourse of human rights and what it's predicated on goes against the very spirit of Hegel's philosophy. So you can look back and say, well, that has historical significance for me today based on the way I conceive of human nature here and now. But you can't say, I'm going to go to Hegel's philosophy and look for a rule or a yardstick by which to measure political action today or by which to measure the significance of events that are happening today. That's the distinction I wanted to make. One way is a bad reading of Hegel, and the other way is more in line with it, I think.
Borna, what do you think?
Well, I largely agree with both Matt and Eric. I think they both point to things that are true about Hegel's philosophy, because he paradoxically, and on the one hand, his political theory, he does say, look, this conception of the state that I'm giving you is rational. The rational state, looks like this. And so a lot of interpreters have read this as being a normative claim, as being a claim of how a political society ought to look like or should look like, right? On the other hand, and this was more kind of common during the Cold War, but on the other hand, Hegel's, the conception of the state that he does present in the philosophy of right, in some ways, reflect the Prussian state of the 1820s. Not entirely, and there's really good, important work to show why that is not the case. But it isn't. So it reflects the Prussian state, and it doesn't in some respects, right? And so for anyone who's trying to make sense of what the hell is going on with Hegel's political theory, it's a bit of a paradox, or it's a bit of a contradiction itself. Because on the one hand, he says, like Matt just pointed out, he says that, philosophy always comes late on the scene of things. Philosophy interprets history and society when that era, when that moment in human history is on the decline. So philosophy for Hegel can only make sense of a political social order when that political social order is has kind of had its day in the sun and is disintegrating. On the other hand, he also says philosophy, and this is something Eric pointed out, philosophy is nothing but the present temporal moment comprehended in thought. So on the one hand, Hegel is saying philosophy always comes too late. On the other hand, Hegel is saying philosophy tries to articulate its present moment in history all the time. Now, if you combine these two things, what he's really saying, and this is my reading, and this is what I'm trying to do in my PhD thesis, I think what he's really getting at here is that politically, philosophy's job is to just kind of look at its present moment in history, try to vaguely describe it, point out the contradictions, point out the problems. And in doing that, in comprehending its present thoroughly, you sharpen those contradictions, which then create the conditions for a new form of society. That, according to Hegel, is a freer and better and more just and good society. So I think you can read him as so. If again, remember, we initially talked about the historical view that we have to keep in mind when thinking about Hegel, right? And this applies to his own philosophy, I think. And so the question, what constitutes a political act is for Hegel a historically situated question, but people have tried to give Hegelian readings of certain historical moments in modern history, right? So in Hegel's philosophy of history, what he says, look, human beings, we act from our passions, right? We act from emotion, from what we think. So human beings, he says, we walk around our day-to-day lives just living our lives. But he says sometimes our individual acts, and this is what Matt was explaining in his example, sometimes your personal acts can have what Hegel calls world historical significance. Rosa Parks sitting on the bus initiated, in a sense, the civil rights movement of the 60s. And so individual personal acts can sometimes align with a bigger historical moment. But there's really no way we can really anticipate it. We can kind of try to anticipate it in some ways, but it's impossible to know, philosophically at least, ahead of time. You can only comprehend this after the fact. You can only think about the necessity of your actions and what the effects they've had from the standpoint of it having happened in the past, if you see what I mean.
And I want to say that, Hegel also has this wonderful egalitarianism about him and world historical significance that you don't see in other figures like Nietzsche or Carlyle, right? Because, to take some of the examples that we brought up, right? The person who started the Arab Spring just was tired of being pushed around by a bunch of police officers who wanted bribes and wouldn't let him sell his fruit. And he kicked off a revolution, right? And that's not what you see in some of these, I think, bad interpreters of Hegel who say that the only people who matter are people like Napoleon, right? Riding on his horse, and he's the one changing the world.
Or Stalin, right? As a later interpreter will say.
Yeah, because it seems to me you can apply this to things that seem much more mundane on the surface of it, because it's just people trying to live their lives, but actually retrospectively it has real significance, what they're doing, right?
All right, I'm very sorry, and it feels like we could go on, but that sounds like a good note to wrap it up on as we are reaching our agreed upon quit time.
Nice.
That time just flew by. Is that just me?
Yeah, that was long.
That's probably our longest one.
Anyways, I'm hoping that this is now the definitive podcast episode on how to read Hegel well and how to read him charitably rather than the way that most of the people we often talk about discredit him for, which is a whole bunch of things like he's too bourgeois, he's elevating bourgeois values, ignoring the working class, espousing some technocracy or whatever. But we'll have to talk about that in a future time. Borna, if you'd like to come back, I think we'd love to have you back. You're sounding kind of like Alain Badiou at the end, so that could be a soon topic to discuss again.
Sure.
But are there any final thoughts before I lock this down and we say goodbye and roll the music?
Oh boy. Final thoughts on Hegel? Never.
I feel a little bit overwhelmed. I feel like I learned more today since grad school.
I would say I think that's entirely appropriate since, I mean, does anybody read Hegel and not come away at the end of it or discuss Hegel thinking like, God damn, that was a lot, you know? It's a lot to fucking take in. I don't know anybody who sits there and is just like, you know, we talked about him and, you know, it's pretty simple, basic stuff, whatever, right?
Self-evident truths.
I gotta commend Borna for not dumbing it down, but also not using terminology or overusing terminology. I felt very unalienated listening to you cover it.
And not compromising and sublating the fuck out of mine and Matt's little back and forth there. That was good.
We didn't even talk about sublation. This word,
we can. Well, I mean, that's a whole different. You have to get into his metaphysics at that point.
I just want to say one thing about Aufhebung or whatever it is. There are 28 distinct meanings in German for Aufhebung, and it can mean something like putting your suitcase up on a shelf. So I don't know German, but I was shocked by that because this is like, everyone's like, oh, sublation. But no, it means canceling, creating, putting up, taking off, putting down, destroying. So I think...
And Hegel means all of those meanings at the same time whenever he says Aufhebung or sublation or supersession as it's sometimes.
I think the philosophy...
So he says everything from, you know, you should get recognition to you should put your suitcase in the right place. That's a very sensible idea. We're all hysterical.
It's a very German thing to suggest too. Make sure you're on the right rack.
Yeah, if you wanna study law today, it's Rechtswissenschaft, which is Recht, science of right.
Thanks very much, Borna, and you other guys. I'll see you later. Yeah. All right. Goodbye.
See you.
Bye.
Bye.
That means just turn off your recording, by the way. Oh, I guess you left.